Tell me about the Sheiks again.
Yeah. So,
because they were actually
in
this
Qatar,
big,
in Qatar and Yemen, and these super wealthy
spots,
super wealthy places where you've got people with literally like money flowing out of the ground, and they so they're big supporters of falconry and preserving some of these historic books and texts of falconry. And so it's based out at in partnership with the Peregrine Fund. That's where their library is housed. And they have a fundraiser every year where they bring in some speakers and talk about falconry. And, they're intense people that keep, hawks and eagles. I mean, I have done an auction where I was on stage with a golden eagle.
Like one of the big,
like a living golden eagle that was on the stage with me. And I'm like doing my auction thing. And one of the trips was to go out with a woman who trains, and this is her eagle. And she goes out and hunts in the public lands in the West
with her eagle
in Nevada and Utah in these big, wide open sagebrush. And they're out hunting, grouse and rabbits and other things, where it's like, you go out there with an eagle and you let it loose and goes up and it, boom, brings it back to you. I mean, it's amazing stuff. But yeah, so this is just
April 26th.
April 26th. Yeah, you'd really get a kick out of that. All these old guys. There's not a lot of sheiks that come in for it, but they fund it. And I think there might have been some. Sorry,
what are you doing over there?
I dropped my glasses.
It's okay.
I dropped
you didn't drop your glasses.
Oh, I dropped
right
mine.
there.
Yeah, that's right. Now I messed up the shot. Are we live here, by the way?
We're already rolling, baby.
Yeah, okay. The Archives of Falconry, it is open to the public. You can get information on their website. I think it's archivesoffalconry.org. You can find it with the Google, Google in the sky.
I didn't know that golden eagles were a thing until I read Carter Niemeyer's book on reintroduction of wolves, right? And then
you didn't realize that golden eagles existed?
I didn't know that was a species of bird. That was a thing.
Yeah.
Like, it's just not like, I'm not a big bird guy. I love parakeets. And
so you don't know anything about an eagle owl?
No such thing as an eagle owl.
Right. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Or a fish eagle, African fish eagle? Nothing?
I don't know. The fisher.
Go ahead.
Isn't the fisher the thing that
the fisher is a mammal? It's
I know.
Remember the mustelid?
Yeah. It's like a weasel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Weasels
like
are also a mustelid.
Yeah. But similar in that I know what a weasel looks like, and then the fisher. We were going to talk. That's what you said at the end of our first episode.
Oh, is that our pickup? Yeah. Our pickup.
Listen,
pickup line.
Yeah. Listen to me. This is what I want to get at. I want to see a golden eagle in person. Is she going to be there at this auction?
I don't think that they're going to have. I think the golden eagle was actually at the Audubon Society auction. That was just one time. That was only a one-time event. So,
and that's the auction on April 19th.
That's April 19th at the Basque Center. Yep.
Which is right around the corner.
Yep.
Okay, listen. Does this golden eagle gal, does she live in Idaho?
I think she lives in like Nevada.
She's useless.
Yeah. But you can get information. She's written some books, and she doesn't. There are a lot of people though. If you came to this event, you could meet some people that go out hawking or falconing, and so they go hunting. I know a guy who lives over in Fairfield, great guy, and raises falcons and hawks and goes out and hunts with them. So yeah, if you want to set that up sometime, because I know you were talking about that, you have an interest in like, I want to go out and experience some of these things. Yes. So like, I don't know if we talked about mushroom picking, but that's one of my favorite hobbies that's coming up here.
Mushroom picking.
So yeah, we'll go out and we'll find some morels here this spring.
Oh yeah.
Take you out and see some of these burned areas, and talking about wildfire and forest management issues. Great opportunity to get out and see what does it look like after the burn in some of these areas. So
yes to all of that. While we're on this topic, I literally just had Representative Wendy Horman in from JFAC, and we brought up the fire budget that the governor had asked, the $60 million to replenish the fund from last year, or pay essentially off the credit card, and then $40 million ongoing. And she was like, listen, we didn't do the $60 million because like we don't even know what the bill was. We were, there are estimates that it might be $60 million, or we might need $60 million in general. She was like, so I think they put in $40 million. To make sure that fund is solvent, and then money going forward. To talk to me about this. Do you think that's going to be sufficient in the coming years? Because the fire management, rangeland management, forest management, you have problems. Like I had Brody Harshbarger, who's one of the Fish and Game commissioners on. He's having a huge problem with grizzly bears in his area, eastern Idaho. And he was like, look, we can't even manage these forests properly because we're not, like, the loggers don't want to go in there when there are grizzly bears running around, and we can't maintain forest roads, logging roads. There are all kinds of problems that they're experiencing. How do we do this? How do we fund? How do we partner with the federal government? And how do we negotiate with, let's say, people that are very hell-bent on reintroduction of grizzly bears and grizzly bear management? Like, these are three big things: the money, the partnership with the federal government, and then dealing with endangered species at the same time.
Yeah. So
there's a lot there.
There's a lot in there. I
think we can
cover. Yeah, let's just go through it a little bit methodically here. So wildfire funding at a state.
Do you want a water, by the way?
No, I got my coffee here.
Great.
I do need to send a text over at some point to the senator's office because I left my water bottle in there, but that's all right.
Which good senator?
I can't disclose that. That's highly classified, confidential information.
They said never to say.
So funding fires, you've got state and then you've got feds. And you've got some local, but really those are the two pots of money that we rely on in this country. And fire is hugely expensive. I mean, we're talking over $1 billion spent regularly when we have a bad fire year. And
in this individual state?
No, nationally.
Yeah. Well, just in the state last year was like $500 million for the federal. I don't think
I haven't seen any specific numbers. I was just looking for that because there's a couple bills, other bills aside from the funding effort for state wildfire suppression.
Okay, so that number may not be accurate.
Yeah, I've heard that at the end, several $100 million is easy. We burned over 800, I think maybe even over 900,000 acres when the final tally was in for last year. So it was a big year. And it tends to be in Idaho that we'll have a bad year and then maybe a mild year or two and then another bad year. But we are definitely seeing increasing intensity, increasing ferocity, increasing soil dryness, which is and fuel dryness, which are huge drivers for fire behavior. 2024 was the hottest year on record. Before that, it was 2023. Before that, it was 2022. Before that, it was 2021. You go back, the last 10 hottest years on record have been in the last 10 years. So, wildfire is a huge issue impacting the West, but also impacting the whole country. Big wildfires going, they might have gotten them under control over the last couple weeks or so down in Texas and Oklahoma. You kind of have this rotational process where, you have fires start out early. I mean, we had a big fire in Colorado here a couple of years ago on New Year's Day, right? We had the California fires this year, whenever that was, huge impacts. And now we get it in Texas, Oklahoma, and then the fire season in New Mexico and Arizona. The Southwest is a different time, driven by some of those, I think, is it the Sirocco winds or the winds? But anyways, we are being so challenged now, and it's like fire comes and it's like, holy smokes, literally get out the way, right? I mean, there are times when you need to do that. There are other times that you can do direct attack or containment efforts, and it's a really complex business, and we spend a tremendous amount of money, in particular on the part of the federal government with the National Interagency Fire Center and the Forest Service and BLM, and you've also got the Park Service and Bureau of Indian Affairs and all the other various, alphabet soup agencies that are involved out there at NIFC. And that is the nerve center for the nation's fire response, is right here in Boise, right down by the airport. You can see it, got a big logo, NIFC, National Interagency Fire Center. Hugely important to all Western and all national and actually all disaster responses. I mean, NIFC plays a huge role in hurricane response, when there was the Columbia shuttle recovery, tornado, wildfires, floods, you name it. I mean, they have such great resources and are so relied upon in times of need in this nation.
Okay.
I am bringing back to Idaho. Coming back to Idaho. So Idaho has, a relatively small share of the state's overall fire suppression responsibility. We own and manage, or we own here in Idaho about 2.5 million acres of state land. Sure. And then you've also got some private land that falls kind of under more state responsibility. And so every year or every 5 years, and it's actually, it takes them a few years to negotiate this, they have a master fire agreement for the state between the feds and the state. Sure. And there's other parties to that, but those are the primary ones, the feds and the state. And they basically divvy up the state zoning and say, okay, we'll protect this area, you protect this one. But the feds have the primary responsibility. So last year, Idaho spent $51 million on wildfires in their area of protection. So that included some of their land, some private land, a little bit of federal land, and then the feds, have big chunks of federal land, but there's also little sections of state land in there, and so they kind of manage that. So it's it operates in accordance with that agreement. Really important, and we'll come back and I'll loop back to that on some of the legislation. But the $51 million that we spent last year, it's continuously appropriated. What that means is that if they had a huge fire year and they spent $1 billion, they do have the access to that money.
It's the
state of Idaho. Okay. The state of Idaho. So we have an account that's kind of a buffer account, if you will. And last year we spent $51 million. So we drew out of that account, and there's I forget what the numbers. I wasn't prepared for this with all my paper. But I can certainly get that over to you. The current balance in that fire fund, and it was probably covered in that interview you did with Representative Foreman. But it is continuously funded. There's a pot of money so they can access that. And if they were to go over that, they issue what's called deficiency warrants. So they kind of go, they go in the red a little bit effectively, but the state is obligated to continuously fund that. So we're not going to run out of money. So that's the good news, is that in times of need, they're not going to be like, well, we can't drop any retardant there or pump any water there because we can't afford it. So that's the good news. So if it does go into the red, the legislature can come back the next year and refill that pot. And what the governor and the Idaho Department of Lands requested was, hey, let's fill that pot up a little bit more so that we have a little bit more of a buffer. So when we have a bad fire year, it doesn't create this shock to the budget. Let's kind of buffer it a little bit. And so at the end of the day, we're still going to be funding fire. And also at the end of the day, the feds are going to be spending probably 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 times as much as the state is spending here in Idaho. And so maintaining that relationship with the federal government to make sure that we're cooperating and managing in line with those agreements is critically important. But so anyways, the second part, so that's some of the funding and the feds, again, have the biggest share of that. The firefighting budget for the overall Forest Service that manages, a number off the top of my head, I want to say 54 million acres of national forests across the country. Their firefighting budget is like 60% of their overall budget. I mean, and it used to be about, 10, 20, right? And it's just crept up. And that's the impact of what we're seeing out there in our forests. And so that issue of fire behavior and fire reality, right? It's a force of nature, and we don't put up big fans to blow away the tornadoes and hurricanes, but we sure could spend a lot of money doing that. We could spend billions of dollars creating huge fans to blow hurricanes away. The point is, I have
no idea what you're saying.
You don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm weaving. I'm doing the weave.
I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand. Look, we have a problem in Idaho with state management being funded, and it sounds like it's like, all right, look, we'll have the funds.
Yeah, we'll have money there,
and then the relationship with the feds, the relationship with like the good neighbor clause.
Yeah, and I'm getting around to that. Okay, I'm doing it.
And then we also have this problem with we're trying to manage listed species that are endangered that also require habitat or enough room within our forest areas that we can't effectively manage that fuel load.
Yeah, that's not true. That's not actually what's going on.
What's going on ever anywhere, or just
sure. You could find some examples of like, some project was slowed down a little bit because there was a endangered fish or something, and they were building a road along the creek, and they didn't follow the rules.
We ended last time talking about the spotted owl. Right, or the barred owl.
Started with it.
Okay, I think we ended with it.
Anyway,
the whole point was like we have hampered significantly our logging industry because of that species, which is fine. Like we have an intention of trying to preserve species, which is great, and sometimes industry needs to change behavior because of that. But that also increases fuel load because obviously the logging industry decreases the fuel load within our forest. So we have examples of species that we're trying to preserve that lead to larger fuel sources for wildfires. And I'm trying to understand, like, how do we manage that?
Okay. So there's a couple things that I want to challenge here.
Sure.
With, I think, the way that you are accepting, I think, some of the arguments around fire behavior and trends in fire behavior. If you look at historical records And it's really important when you're talking about fire that you look at historical records, because that climate, the temperature and precipitation that we have in any given year are huge drivers, along with dry lightning and high winds in late summer.
Sure.
Those are the drivers. You could have really dry conditions and very low ignitions, and you don't have a bad fire season.
Sure.
But when you have a big lightning bust that comes through and starts 200 fires, and it challenges your ability to hop on every single one of those, you're going to have a big fire bust. And that's just the simple reality.
Move back to you're
sliding.
You're dying to get that mic on your right shoulder.
Yeah.
Like, I want to be over here.
All right.
So keep going.
So, when you look back at that historic fire patterns, we actually had huge amounts of fires in like the mid 1800s, early 1900s, like factors of magnitude over what we have had. So after World War II, when we had really the development of the airplane industry and the proliferation of ultimately air tankers and aerial suppression, in addition to the Forest Service's implementation of what was known as the 10 a.m. policy. Any wildfire that is out there on public lands is going to be extinguished by 10 a.m. the next day. So we had a situation where we became much more effective at managing and reducing wildfire extent of area burned in this country, in particular in the West. I'm going to focus mostly on the West, but huge issues in the East too. I mean, those Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota are not immune to large wildfire events, and we are starting to see that. But out in the West, we saw the advent and the use of airplanes.
Right.
And we became much more effective at suppressing fire. And that also coincided with some climatic conditions that lasted really until about 1988. Do you remember what happened in 1988?
No.
Yellowstone caught on fire. And the huge fires captured the nation's attention. And it was like, oh my gosh, like Yellowstone is burning down. Who can we blame? Well, let's blame the environmentalists. Right. And so it became this narrative that was very easy to accept that somehow, even though we were really at the peak of logging on public lands, on national forests in particular, around 1988, around the time of President Ronald Reagan, we were at the peak there, yet we saw these huge fires. And so let's look at Yellowstone. Okay, it is a lodgepole pine dominated environment. Lodgepole pine burns in general somewhere between every 150 to 300 years or so. It burns in stand replacing events. It is the cones of the lodgepole are known as serotinous cones. And what that means is that they have to be superheated to a temperature. I don't know what it is, a couple hundred degrees for those seeds to even pop open.
Right.
So in the absence of fire, you would have the least healthy forest ever in Yellowstone. And it occurs over 300, 500, 1,000-year time frames. So you go on vacation to Yellowstone in September of 1988, and you would say, oh my God, this place is destroyed. You go back there in 100 years and you say, this place is amazing. Look at how healthy these trees are.
Right.
You go there at 300 years after you've had some bark beetles go through, because the mountain pine beetle is adapted to eat and thrive only on lodgepole pine that are greater than 7 inches in diameter at base height or at chest height. So, basically you have this species of beetle that is totally endemic and natural, and has been here
it's all
for
part
time
of a
immemorial.
larger cycle.
And they kill off a lot of the trees, not all of them. And so sometimes you have some environments like in Yellowstone, because it's so gosh darn cold, right? Where's the coldest temperature in the country? It's usually either in Stanley or West Yellowstone or somewhere up in northern Minnesota. It's one of the coldest places in America, in the lower 48. And so
it's
sometimes
colder than the Dakotas?
Yeah, oftentimes.
Really?
Yeah, if you look
no idea.
if you look in the newspaper, some of us still get the newspaper, it'll have the coldest temperature in the nation. Oftentimes West Yellowstone, sometimes Stanley gets it.
You probably get the Statesman. They're a super fan of mine.
I don't want to say anything bad. But I do subscribe to some papers.
Oh my God.
No further comment. We can maybe edit that one out. Anyways, there is a narrative here of like, oh, well, if we only just log more. Fire, where it starts, if there is fuel, it will burn. whether it is a 10-year-old plantation, and given the right wind conditions, you can have a plantation that burns over really hot. You can have a clear cut that burns over really hot. You can have an old growth forest that burns hot. And you can also have an old growth forest that completely stops a fire because you have so much moisture content in the trees that actually the fire behaves differently. Fire is a dynamic process, and it doesn't fit neatly into a bucket. And so the narrative of, oh, we used to log more and that's why we're having more fire, is disassociated from the reality and some of the patterns and trends that we've seen over the years. So I would just challenge your thinking on that a little bit. But there are absolutely dynamics here around how can we best manage our Western communities so that we can live with wildfire, because it's going to happen, and also live with the species who are native to this land, and that we have an obligation, and there's a public trust obligation on the part of the state to manage that wildlife for the benefit of Idahoans, and to maintain that. We also have at the federal level the Endangered Species Act and other laws that govern how we manage species and how we protect that habitat, because there's a lot of important habitat on private land, but there's a lot of habitat that's important on public land too. Right. And so managing that balance, but the economics are such a driver of this. I mean, when you look at, but here, let me just quickly say this, and then you can interrupt me.
There is no quickly.
Okay, fine. Okay, go ahead. But I'm going to come back to I'm going to come back to fire issues and grizzly bears.
Yeah,
that's like
Jonathan. I feel like you're somebody who doesn't get listened to enough.
And oh, jeez. You should watch some of my video the testimony in the last 2 weeks in the legislature. I stand up there. I make great points. I point out legal opinions and how it's unconstitutional, and they're like, "Thank you for your comments."
Well, they don't even thank me, so at least you get the thanks. But
I made them laugh twice in House State Affairs this week.
Kind of a big deal. I don't know what to tell you. What I find interesting, not necessarily interesting, but definitely to be clear, whenever people talk about considerations, I find that most people who are receiving those think that consideration is being portrayed as the only thing to be considered. Now, again, to be clear, when I say, hey, the logging industry has been at least somewhat restricted by, let's say, species preservation, and that has led to an increased fuel. That does not mean that I think the only thing driving wildfires in the world is like that the loggers haven't been able to go in. Naturally, it has to do with, all
You're
kinds
saying
of
I'm
things.
trying to pigeonhole you.
Well, I think what most people do is they reduce down one aspect of a hyper complex system to this thing where it's like, okay, we're not going to talk about that because it's like there are these 5 other considerations. So this one isn't important. It's like, wait a minute. All 6 of these are important. We just have to talk about, like, I'm just saying, hey, this is one aspect of it, right? Because again, if we had all the loggers log down all the trees, we would not have forest fires. If we have,
I don't agree with that.
Okay, so if there are no trees and there's no forest, we don't have forest fire.
Have you ever heard of a range fire or grassland fire?
I'm saying forest fire.
Okay, but you still have a fire that can burn down people's homes.
I'm not saying you can't have a rangeland fire, right? Like that's the nature of making sure we have appropriately
Just
managed
for the record,
fire.
you couldn't have a fire on the moon. Not enough
unless there's a lander with oxygen in it, and then the astronauts also die. It just happens to be on the moon. Okay. Now, what I'm trying to say is...
But in the absence of oxygen, would there be flames?
Okay. We're just going to... Every episode I do with you, we're just going to call the Oppenheimer Show. Why don't you continue on with your list?
This episode brought to you by J.D. Oppenheimer.
Oh,
okay. I want to say one thing. So there are some really logical things, that you say, like, hey, if we didn't have trees, it wouldn't burn. So...
I said we wouldn't have a forest fire.
Yeah, you would.
No I'm not saying there would never
there
be
I go, trying to manipulate your words again.
A little bit.
The nerve.
I can't believe it. Keep going.
So, when you think about like a forest, like if you've ever been out driving around Idaho and you've seen a bunch of, trees that are either red needles, that have been attacked by mountain pine beetles or some other disease or insect, and then you see some green trees next to it. Which do you think presents more of a fire risk?
I don't know.
You don't know. So a lot of people think to themselves, and there's, logic in it, obviously, like, hey, when I start a campfire, if I have wet wood, the wood that's still green, it doesn't burn as well
be smoky,
as the dry stuff.
It's gonna be
the
gross.
Stuff that's dry, it's been dead, it's really crispy, man, that stuff just goes up in a flash. Absolutely true. So logically, a lot of people think, oh, if I see a lot of dead or dying trees, the red needles or kind of the ghost timber, like the great trees, that there's increased fire risk. Some researchers down in Colorado, I think her name was Tanya Schoenagel, but we can double check that for the record. But did some research, or maybe it was Diana Fix, but some researchers out of Colorado who looked at the dynamics and some of the patterns on the landscape, some of the fire intensity, fire occurrence over, big data sets, looking at 20, 40, 80 years, and correlating that with some of the areas of pine beetles in particular and defoliators on trees, insects that eat the foliage, defoliators. And what they found, together. I know, but you're not the smartest guy, is what you keep telling me.
I'm not going to disagree with you there.
And there are people that listen to this. Don't get me started there. But hey, no, we love them all. We love them all, and you love them. You've got pictures of many of your listeners, so if you're listening out there, make sure to send in your picture. But anyways, this research out of Colorado found, this disassociation that actually in areas where you had extensive beetle kill, you had less occurrence and less severe fires. So what's happening there? The issue is that those green trees with the sap in them tend to actually be more flammable because of some of the resins in the trees and more explosive. And so you can actually get more intense fires in some areas where you have green trees than where you have dead ones. But the logical conclusions that many people think when they look up at a hillside and see some red trees is they're like, oh, that's suffering from poor health. No, it's not. What it's suffering from, or what you're seeing is you're seeing the dynamic, multi-centennial long, systems where you have some trees that are being naturally thinned out by the beetles, maybe because there's been an absence of fire, or maybe there's not enough nutrients or water there to support all those trees. It dies and then it falls over the course of 15, 20, 50 years. It becomes part of the soil. You have this natural cycling. And that's not to say that areas with extensive beetle kill can't burn. They absolutely can. But the bigger risk that we have to our public lands and forests, when you look at some of the impacts of a changing climate along with wildfire, is the complete loss of species. So like down in the desert Southwest, there are some tree species that basically they've exceeded the ability to survive, right? And there's just not enough water for some of those pinyon pine forests to continue to survive. So you have basically a complete wipeout of that species. We've seen some of that here in Idaho with the whitebark pine as a result of a non-native pest called white pine blister rust that came in the early part of the 1900s and has spread across the country and impacted a lot of that. The 5-needle pines here in Idaho, white pine and whitebark being some of the predominant ones. Northern Idaho used to be white pine country, right? It was these amazing stands of giant white pine that were, it's our state tree, but right now it's not doing well. They've been trying to study it. But anyway, my point is that you have these dynamic systems that are adapted, and it's difficult, when you have a big 100,000 acre fire, and if that's in your backyard and it takes 20 or 50 years for that and it doesn't take that long for it to recover and be beautiful. Sure. The next spring you can go out there and see amazing wildfires. I've gone out in April and May of the year following an intense fire, and I've seen cottonwood sprouts that were 6-8 feet tall in April and May, right after a fire. There is an amazing production and cycling of nutrients and availability of nutrients after a fire. These exposed seed beds for plants, also for weeds, and that's a big problem, especially in some of the cheatgrass country that's been speeding that up. But anyways, my point is that fire...
Can I just say something real fast?
Yeah, if you make it quick. You're
like, let
me just get in 14 more points.
And to that point, I had this great joke with my wife. So when we were, living in our previous life, and we had little babies, and they were like potty training them and stuff.
Yeah. During the pandemic.
Yeah.
It was so easy.
So rough. But we, one of the ways we had potty training is like, we just let, our boys, when they were like 2 or whenever they were ready, to like run around in the backyard, naked, and then they like pick a plant to piss on. And that was like, this was our strategy, right? And she would always get mad. She's like, I just planted them. I'm like, no, let him urinate on it. Like it's high quality. So we got into this. I was like, he's putting nutrients in.
So you were doing the research on his urine to determine the nitrogen and phosphorus content?
Right. So what I did is I was like, I'm pretty sure this is a strategy. And so I looked up, again, did a little research on it, and they're like, oh yeah, a mechanism of fertilization in some places in, for instance, Africa, they take ash from, fires and they mix it with urine and, put it all, and all the stuff. I was like, there we go. Because you have this really high nutrient content. And if mixed properly, it is very beneficial for growth, right? It's like this fertilizer you wouldn't imagine.
Manure and urine both can be utilized and repurposed.
And you mix it with ash.
At the appropriate scale, when you're talking about, 70 million tons every day,
Yeah, it's a lot. That's a little bit more than people are used to having.
Yeah, but
anyway,
so like
if you obviously.
You're good. I can talk about urine all day long. But if you are if you're peeing in a pot and having the whole family pee in that same pot, that might kill the plant.
Sure.
But the little baby with only, a couple ounces a day at most of urine production, we're talking, and pretty diluted, because I'm guessing your kids are pretty well hydrated.
Right,
so
it's
probably clear in color.
Right.
Do you recall the color of the urine?
This is not a strategy that I want to engage in the podcast, but I would... Like, this is what the urine looked like. No, but what to that point also with like, you have dogs, right? Dogs pee on grass. You have that dead spot right in the beginning, and then this mass growth ring around it as the concentration decreases, and then back to normal grass. It's like, this is the way to do it.
Or is it just the increased availability of resources because it's killed some of the grass in the center of that circle, and so it's not sucking up the water. It's not sucking up the water and competing with that other grass. So is I don't know the answer to this. Is the ring of growth around?
I believe the problem is you burn the roots in the immediate area in like the first 3-inch radius. And then as the concentration of, I think it's nitrogen or nitrates, as that concentration decreases, you get this ring of optimal growth where it's like, we're getting just enough. So that's when the grass grows up. And then you go another like 8-inch radius around, and it's like they didn't get any of the nutrients. So you have a burn when you have too much, and then you have optimal, and then you have nothing. And that's why you see like grass, huge ring, and then dead spot.
Mm-hmm. This segment of the program brought to you by Flomax. Flomax.
Oh my God.
Have you ever wanted to impress your friends with thick rope-like streams of urine?
We are
that's a Saturday Night Live. That's a Saturday Night Live skit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, or a commercial, like a fake ad for Flomax. Like,
did you see?
They have like the sound of like a horse pissing. Like when you're at a party or visiting your girlfriend's house, you want to impress them with.
I just remember
rope-like streams.
It was like colon blow Saturday Night Live commercial. That one was pretty good. There was also one where that I think it was Adam Sandler who was doing the bit. It's a pill. Did you ever see that one? Where it's like, this helped. Anyway, I'll show it to you later. It's pretty.
When you bring up Adam Sandler, what that makes me think of is the forced economics of timber harvest in grizzly bear country and in the kind of northeast.
That was my segue, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I think Adam Sandler, and I think, maybe there actually is a tie-in. Jimmy Kimmel, as you know, owns a fly fishing ranch over on the South Fork of the Snake River here in Idaho.
Does he really?
He's a big fan of Idaho and the beautiful places that we have here, and he has all kinds of his friends out there. I'm pretty sure that
the Henry's Fork.
Henry's Fork and the South Fork of the Snake come together to form the main.
Because I'm going to go meet Brandon Hoffner from the. He was here, and he invited me over. We did a great podcast. And I was like, I want to come this summer to Henry's Fork and check it out.
Oh God, it's so gorgeous over there.
Yeah,
you're gonna just.
It's going to be great. I'm going to take my boys. We're going to go fly fishing.
Yeah, it's going to be.
I don't really know how to fly fish.
You don't need to. Well, you do a little bit over there. Some places in Idaho, the fish are. Some of the places, the fish are. Well, you'd like them because they're not that smart. So they'd be good to have on your program.
Those are the people I hang out with.
Yeah, those are the people that would be good for your program. But anyway, over in Henry's Fork, they're some of the cutthroat over there are pretty wily, and you've also got some rainbows, and there's some big old ones. And so they get to be huge. I mean, it's so productive over there because of the nutrients again in some of those lakes, and Henry's Lake and Island Park Reservoir.
Henry's
you get
30
plus inch fish over there. They're just gorgeous, and the colors, especially in the fall. And you get elk bugling to wake you up in the morning, and occasional grizzly bears that stumble through. But
I gotta get out of here.
Yeah, you
got to get out of the basement.
You got to get out of the basement, man. Idaho is amazing, and the snow's melting, and this is just the time of year. I mean, it's a fantastic spring and early summer, just magnificent times because there's not big crowds out there. Yeah. And I mean, really, when you go to the right spots in Idaho, there's never big crowds. I mean,
do you know the director of recreation, Parks and Recreation?
Susan Buxton, yeah.
Susan Buxton. Okay. Do you personally know? Like, do you have her phone number?
I probably do. I can give that to you. I'm not going to read it over the air.
That's a bad idea.
That would be a bad idea. It's 208 something.
Okay.
Yeah, but we'll get that to you. But again, forest economics. So, in order to cut down trees, put them on a truck, drive them to a mill them into dimensional lumber or some other useful product, and then ship them to a market where people want to buy the products with their money. That takes a lot of, energy and time and, a lot of cost associated with that. So it's, when you look at the trajectory of the timber industry here in Idaho, what we saw was a trend that I think, from my working on this issue for, going on almost 30 years, from working on kind of timber economics, incentives, public lands, and other issues related to that, the, accessibility to mills and milling infrastructure, the value of the timber, the cost of maintaining and managing road systems, and just the inherent value in the timber is the single largest driver. And also you've obviously got huge international market pressures and influences. If you're importing a lot of softwood from Canada, that's going to drive down the price, and it's going to be more, you're going to lose your shirt. And so when you look at the timber industry in Idaho, we used to have a number of mills down in southern Idaho, and Boise Cascade, was a big player here in Idaho. And in the early 90s or so, there was a lot of noise made about, it's the environmentalists, slowing everything down. And actually there was a time when, Boise Cascade was shuttering their mill in Cascade, and they, put their employees on a school bus and drove them down to the Idaho Conservation League parking lot and had a protest there, basically protesting and blaming the Idaho Conservation League for shutting down the mill, when the reality of the situation is that in that time frame, we saw a dramatic modernization and increase in efficiencies in timber mills in the West, and consolidation of the industry and closures of a lot of the lower performing mills. And if you look at the timber in southern Idaho, because it's so dry, it can take you 80 years to grow a commercial sized tree, and lodgepole pine, which dominates a lot of our higher, kind of mid elevation forests in southern Idaho across the Boise, the Payette, certainly in the Sawtooth country, it's almost 100% lodgepole pine. Up in the Island Park area, again, almost 100% monoculture of lodgepole pine. It can take over 100 years for that to grow to economic maturity. The culmination of the mean annual increment is what it's called, if you really want to get technical. I know you like it when I talk technical. No, but it basically is like when the tree is like, it is
commercially viable.
It's commercially viable, and you've reached kind of the apex of like how much growth is it putting on every year versus the cost to replant and get something else growing there. And so when it takes so long, and the lodgepole pine is really not, you don't go into a beautiful building and say like, oh, is this all lodgepole pine? It's like, it's kind of a little, I love lodgepole pine. It has a fun Latin name if your listeners want to look that up, and it's fun to say out loud and figure out how to pronounce it. But it is not a valuable commercial tree, really. It's good for post and pole. So you want to build some fence. Okay, we can, do a small sale here and there. But so like the dynamics of fire management and timber harvest are driven by economics is really my point. And that sure, you do also have some influence of, federal policy as it relates to endangered species, Clean Water Act, other environmental laws. You got to follow those. Why do you have to follow those? Well, the Congress of the United States and the President of the United States passed a law that says you got to follow these, but at the end of the day, those things are fungible, right? You can change those laws, and so that's something that we work on at the Idaho Conservation League. Ultimately, we want to make sure, and I talked about how Boise Cascade, 30 years ago or so, hired a school bus to come down and protest in our parking lot. Over the last 20, 30 years, what we've done is we've evolved those relationships. So now we work very closely with the timber industry in Idaho at the Idaho Conservation League. People would be surprised to know that they are some of our most important partners. What we saw in the desert Southwest, in some of the forests there, was you saw the timber industry completely up and move away. They left the state because they're like, hey, the economics don't work for us here. It's even drier in Arizona and New Mexico than it is in southern Idaho. So the pinyon pine and lodgepole and other species there, I mean, they're really not, that's not how you're making money. The way you make money in timber is faster growing sites. So where is that? Southeastern United States, Mississippi, Alabama, some of those areas.
What about the Pacific Northwest?
And also, I was going to say the Pacific Northwest, you've got a lot of timber industry. Weyerhaeuser's really the big private player there. And those timber economics and how those influence the market are huge players. If you have, think about this. Think about this. Well, here, this is a really good example when you talk about the Cascades. You have a lot of those lands that are checkerboarded, right? So you've got a section of state forest, you've got a section, and when I say section, it's in the west, it's section and township, right? So a section is 640 acres, and you've got a section of state, a section of private, a section of Forest Service. When that section of state is hammered pretty hard because they have to produce money and income for the public schools, and the section of private is really hammered because Weyerhaeuser is trying to provide stock dividends and keep their shareholders happy and maintain that that cash flow. Then the Forest Service is looking at their section and they're like, okay, well, we've got all these impacts here. We've got to look at this overall watershed and the habitat. These two areas have been hammered pretty hard. We got to slow down a little bit on our section, manage that a little bit more cautiously, because our responsibility is to make sure that, we've got the species that were there that maybe are now pushed off of some of those other lands that have been managed. But at the end of the day, we have found ways to get along with the timber industry where they can remove merchantable material from the forest. They can remove trees. They can do timber harvest in a way. They can use some of the revenue from that to fix up some stream wildlife issues or fisheries issues. They can do some wildlife habitat improvement. They can do some weed treatment. They can also fix some trails and some roads to make sure that the public can get in there afterwards. Or perhaps it's an area where we're like, hey, we did some logging in here. We don't want a bunch of people running their ATVs up here because that's going to disturb some of the elk and deer habitat that really need some more of that security. And so, it's this balancing act. And at the end of the day, we've got to provide the clean water that flows from our national forests. In 1947, the Idaho legislature passed almost unanimously a resolution demanding that the federal government keep managing the federal lands because it is so important to water availability in southern Idaho. I think we talked about this last time. But anyways, these really complex, so you've got international economic forces, you've got local economic forces, climatic influences, and, then you throw in soils and all these other things. And, are they productive soils there? Are they really, do they have a lot of, growing capacity, or are they, here's another word that you'd like, are they somewhat depauperate? Depauperate. It means that they're kind of like, just kind of gray and ashy, just kind of like, no. So anyways, the point is that, it's really easy sometimes to say like, oh, well, yeah, there's grizzly bears there and that's why there's not logging. There's a whole slew of issues that have contributed to that. And at the end of the day, if we want to find a way to coexist with bears, we do it in Wyoming, we do it in Montana, we do it in Idaho, and we want to find a way that, how do we minimize conflict? If there's grizzly bears out there and they wander through the high country every once in a while and maybe eat an elk, okay. Yeah. a lot of people in Idaho occasionally go out and shoot an elk and put it in their truck and put it in their freezer and they eat it for a year. Well, grizzly bears have a more voracious appetite than you and I do, but they're going to live off that elk for a while, and the way they store up, their fat and whatnot, but at the end of the day, figuring out ways to minimize conflict. We don't want them getting into people's pastures. We don't want them getting them into people's sheep or cows. We want it, and so how can we spend some money, to install preventive measures? Let's make sure that we're managing some of the cattle carcasses from ranching operations, because occasionally cattle die. Right. If you leave them out there on the range, they're an attractant, and you get bears coming in and they're like, wow, this is really tasty. There's another cow over there. I'm going to go test that one out, that's maybe alive, right? And so managing those carcasses, same thing along trains. You get trains going through with a lot of grain and other feed and other things. It attracts bears in. You engender these conflicts. Same thing with garbage. How do we manage our garbage cans? You might think like, oh, that's not the most important thing. I put it out on the curb, it's fine. Well, if you live in bear country, it is a thing, and you need to have a bear-proof canister. And when you minimize that conflict, then that garbage or that carcass is not an attractant to bring in bears and create this conflict. And you're not teaching the bears, and especially the younger ones, because mama teaches the cub, and it says, hey, this is a great place. The garbage dump is a great place to go and get your meal. And then all of a sudden, the garbage man or someone's out there unloading their construction debris or something. All of a sudden they've got a mama grizzly bear with a couple cubs in tow. That is not a good situation, and it ends up with dead bears. And so, we want to manage and maintain bears in a self-sustaining and connected, making sure that we have some connection between these different grizzly bear populations is critically important under the Endangered Species Act. You've got a population around Yellowstone, and it's doing pretty well. You've got a population up in extreme North Idaho and Boundary County, in the Selkirks and the Cabinet Mountains, two separate populations up there in the Panhandle. You wouldn't think it's big enough for two bear populations, but it is. You got the Kootenai River and that valley in between. Beautiful area of the state as well. Some great hiking and fishing up there too. But those two populations are pretty isolated, and we've seen a little bit of growth, and they're kind of hanging on. But unless they have the ability to connect and have some of that genetic interchange, you're going to have these genetically isolated populations, and they're not going to do well. And then it's going to cost a bunch of money, because you're going to need to, bring in some genes from Yellowstone, and and if we figure out ways, how can we manage and coexist with bears in a way that they can move some and expand, in line with minimizing conflict and taking preventive measures to make sure that ultimately we all want to see grizzly bears come off the endangered species list, right? It is in everyone's best interest. You can have, hunters that are out there harvesting an appropriate number of bears. But right now, we don't even know what those numbers would be, because the state doesn't have a management plan for them. They have a conservation agreement that manages some of the bear populations and how they count different bear mortalities down in the Yellowstone region, but they don't have a plan to say this is how we're going to manage them in Idaho. And so that's something that needs to be done. But anyways, back to the main point is that, it's really easy to say like, oh yeah, we've got endangered species, that's why we're not logging. Well, you gotta crack, start peeling back some of the layers of that onion. As you were saying, same thing as kind of, I'm not going to say it was a criticism of me, but maybe some commentary on my approach or what you've seen was the notion of, that, if you say like, oh, I like pigeonholed you in some way, saying like, one factor is the only thing. These things it's an onion, right? And you start peeling off a layer, and you're like, let's talk about economics. Let's talk about, tribal treaty rights. Sure. Let's talk about responsibility for native plants. And, let's talk about noxious weeds. Let's talk about the role of cheatgrass in southern Idaho ecosystems. So, there's so many different layers.
If I may sum up then, what you're essentially saying is
7 words or less.
Look, in eastern Idaho, you had a logging industry that was not long for this life because of the nature of the lumber product and the economics tied to it. That led to and tying that together with increased efficiency based on technology, you needed fewer employees, you needed less manpower, you got higher efficiency per person, and you have an industry that's largely moving out or not really coming after the logging products that are available there. You couple that with unnecessary and sometimes difficult conflict with grizzly bears and humans, but people largely
and bull trout and salmon.
So you have all of these different things factoring into a decrease in logging in southeast Idaho that should not be and would inappropriately be tied exclusively to grizzly bear. And therefore, grizzly bear may be one of the factors, but you have to look at the larger, multi-decade push away from logging in eastern Idaho.
Yeah. Well, I mean, logging was it was never huge in eastern Idaho. This is there were a few mills here and there, and I won't dispute that some of those have gone out of business. We've seen consolidation and loss of mills across the country. As they've become more efficient and identified where does it really make sense. Even if there were no grizzly bears listed, even if bull trout was not listed on the endangered species list, even if you did not have wolverine or lynx listed on the endangered species list, all those species occur. I'm thinking over in that island park in the Caribou-Targhee National Forest in eastern Idaho that runs really all the way from Bear Lake all the way up to Yellowstone, and then it abuts the Salmon Chalice National Forest. Also, all of these amazing landscapes, all of the national forests in Idaho, worth visiting. Encourage you to do so. I can give you some great spots in each of those. Won't announce them over the air because then they wouldn't be great spots, but I might be willing to tell you.
Divulge off there. Yeah.
But anyways, the even if you got rid of all those endangered species listings, I guarantee you that there would not be a timber company that would say, we're going to move in there and we're going to build a $20 million timber mill to harvest the trees. I can guarantee you that. But I can tell you where, well, actually I can't. I can tell you one of the two states where Idaho Forest Group has built their new mill, and it's down in the southeast. It's, I think I don't know if it's in Mississippi or Alabama, but it's in one or the other. But they have this is the Idaho Forest Group, which is a timber company based up in North Idaho. I want to say they've got 5 or so mills, and they're one of the largest timber purchasers of federal timber in the country. I think top 5. They're a big company. They're based here in Idaho, a privately owned company, and they just built a mill down in the southeast because that's where there's opportunity to, harvest trees relatively quickly. A lot of that is paper, but some of it is dimensional lumber, I believe. But that's where they're investing because the economics support it. It's gotcha. The economics would not support. There are certainly opportunities for value-added products from our forests, whether it is looking at some post and pole operations, some small-scale harvesting, potentially some, small-scale dimensional lumber. And it's important to scale that appropriately, because if you come in and say, oh, we're going to build a, $20 million new facility here, you got to feed that. And if you don't have the feedstock for it, if you don't have enough timber available, it's just not going to work. And at the end of the day, lodgepole pine just really doesn't pay its way out of the woods. And so, what we increasingly see, and this is something that is also important, I think, for your listeners to understand, is that the Forest Service has been doing environmental analyses on prescribed fire programs that cover effectively the entirety of the national forest. So the Boise, the Payette, I think the Sawtooth, the Salmon Chalice. I just saw a notice that the Panhandle National Forest is proposing a project here is basically saying we're going to approve a prescribed fire proposal for the entire national forest. And when situations present themselves where we can safely ignite prescribed fire that minimizes some of the negative impacts that we see from large wildfires, then we're going to take that opportunity. And so that's really, to scale up some of the approaches to address some of the wildfire conditions that we're seeing out there. Using fire as a tool is the only thing that we can do that will really deal with this at potentially an appropriate scale. I don't even know that it would be enough, because to get ahead of this issue, I think they've identified you might need to do 50,000 acres of burning every year. And that's a lot of burning. It's more burning than we're used to. And so, but it's kind of like a pay me now, pay me later type situation. Like, okay, we can either do some prescribed fires when we can manage them and carefully protect some of those resources in the spring, sometimes in the fall, but usually in the spring, or we can wait until August and then let Mother Nature, take the reins, and we're just rolling the dice there. And but at the end of the day, it is important to recognize that these fires and systems, watersheds have adapted to wildfire disturbance, over millennia. And when you know what to look for, you can drive out, along Highway 21 heading up towards Stanley, and you can see some of those, they're referred to as alluvial fans at the bottoms of some of the creeks, where you kind of see this like fan shape, right? And that's from these like sediment flows over the years. So you get these big disturbances, and that's how the mouths of these creek forms, and it incisors the channel of the stream differently. And that, can happen just from a big a thunderstorm that comes through and dumps 3-4 inches of rain in one little drainage and just kind of scours it out. It can also happen from wildfires and debris flows and all sorts of things like that. But these are really dynamic systems. And when you're just taking a snapshot in time as a human who lives a relatively short 80 years on this planet, what you're seeing is literally just that snapshot. And that's that's a creek that has taken billions of years to develop into its semblance, or at least, hundreds of millions of years following some of the volcanic eruptions and when the seas receded and the lands rose and all that kind of stuff. But I won't cover all of that this morning. But anyways, the point is, I am really intrigued by the issue of fire management, fire dynamics, fire ecology, fire politics, forests, and I could go on and on.
I know you do. I gotta cut you short, my guy.
I know. Have we already taken the whole hour? Because I feel like we just started.
I bet you do. I bet you do. God bless you, sir. Come back. We'll do it again.
All right. And just for the record, my name is Jonathan Oppenheimer. I am the executive director of the Idaho Conservation League. Thanks so much to Mark for having me on. And maybe he will get my name spelled right on his website. Just for the record, Jonathan, not John. There are a lot of wonderful people named John out there, but I am not one of them. So thank you, Martin.
God bless you, sir.